Is Venezuelan oil worth chasing? As we all know, America has entered Venezuela, and the media would have it that this is about both regime change and to take command of the country's oil. Although it could be that the former motive is just to enable the second one. Either way, we're not here to discuss politics, but rather the practicalities of reinvigorating the Venezuelan oil industry and what difference that will make to America and the rest of the world. I'm Tim Fryer, and joining me as usual from the E+T team is Jack Loughran, and the expertise today is provided by Alan Gelder, Senior VP of Refining, Chemicals and Oil Markets, the global research and consultancy group Wood Mackenzie. So welcome, Alan.
Thank you.
So maybe we could start with unravelling some of the nuances around the situation. Whether or not they should have been there in the first place, there are huge American oil companies who felt they were muscled out of the area in the 1970s when the Venezuelan government nationalised the industry, and there was further reclaiming of American assets in 2007. So is there an element of this situation which is about America, from its perspective, reclaiming what was once theirs?
But that's a tricky question. It seems to be the thesis for, well, one of the reasons for the actions that we've just seen. For the companies that have left, Exxon and Conoco, they went through arbitration. That arbitration claim has been defined. It's multi-billion dollars, hasn't yet been paid. Arguably, having accepted the arbitration and the outcome, then they probably don't have a claim on the oil in the ground.
Well, you're saying the Venezuelan government is refusing to pay a kind of globally recognised court judgment?
Payment is tricky because of, I'm not a legal expert, but I understand those payments haven't been made, and Venezuela struggles to have access to US dollars because of sanctions. But my understanding is most of those claims are outstanding, with Conoco's being the biggest, and they're, I think, in aggregate, about $15 billion.
And this is based on assets that were seized by the Venezuelan government in 2007?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that they were given an option to limited share in their assets. And if they didn't agree to that, then they were reclaimed. And that's effectively what Exxon and others were saying, I think.
And the difference in the payments or the claims related to how many years was left on the original agreement they signed. I think Exxon wasn't very long. For Conoco, it was much longer. And so the biggest claim is from Conoco because it arguably, that contract was closed, had a much longer term to run.
In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil resources, but it was primarily American oil majors that came in to actually get it out of the ground, right? What happened in that 30-year period then? Was it the oil firms building and maintaining the infrastructure while the Venezuelan government were just sort of happy with the sort of proceeds of the sale of that oil, or was there a combined effort between the two parties?
Much more of a combined effort, because in the 70s you had the establishment of PDVSA, which my Spanish isn't good enough to give you exactly what it stands for, but it's the Venezuelan State National Oil Company. And from my understanding, our understanding, it was a very skilled, very competent organization that was very good at getting oil, extracting and processing Venezuelan oil, and either exporting that oil to the US or converting it, because they were also a large refining center, or converting that into products, a lot of which were again exported to North America. So it was a very technically competent organization. It's effectively been hollowed out by sort of those people leaving. You'll find skilled Venezuelan nationals all around the global oil industry, Middle East, Canada. They appear in all sorts of places because they're good at what they do.
So brain drain, effectively.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it really was a sort of rags to riches and then back to rags again, wasn't it? Because during that really golden spell, I think they were the world's biggest oil exporter. And when we were chatting beforehand, you described them as the first proper petrostate.
I think that's where the term petrostate was tagged, because previously, prior to the oil discoveries, Venezuelan was an agrarian economy. I think it largely exported coffee, and then oil comes along and completely takes over, and it became the black curse of the black gold, where it it strengthens the economy, everything else, they buy everything in, but it was an incredibly wealthy economy in the 70s.
And they improved the country's infrastructure. They, in some ways, as we see in the Middle East now, they invested that oil money wisely for the state. But then it all went pear-shaped with the regime change, for one thing, and then there was a collapse in the oil prices in the 80s as well, wasn't there?
Yep.
And there's not been stability in the system ever since.
I can say in the period from 76 to 2007, you did have investments because it became the sort of the 50-50 revenue share deal, and companies were quite willing to work on that. They could extract the oil, and so you did have investments from a lot of the majors at that time, and then things started to go awry in the 2015, 16, 17 timeframe with the Chavez regime, and that's when things got very difficult. And
So between nationalisation and the 2007 appropriation of oil resources, the actual infrastructure to extract the oil was largely running pretty smoothly the whole time. And so it's only since 2007 that we've seen problems start to arise, which has inevitably resulted in Venezuela actually being unable to export as much oil as it once did.
yeah, I think in 2000, Venezuela was producing about 3 million barrels a day. Yeah. Now it's 800. It's the order of 800,000.
Right.
So prior to that period, it was a large producer, exporter, refiner, and very, very good at it. Now that a lot of that system has fallen into disrepair.
And so why is that? Was it all those skills left, or was it lack of investment from foreign companies and from internally from Venezuela as well?
Bits of a combination of both, because if I think back a long time ago when we looked at, so one of the metrics we sort of use is what is the fiscal break even that a country needs in terms of oil price, for how much they're spending. I remember, this must be 10 years ago, the Middle East was the $60, $70 price. Venezuela was like 110, 120 or 140 because of how much money they were spending. And so with the expropriation, the change of conditions, less investment, then effectively things got difficult and money was trying to be extracted to fund the rest of the economy, and things fell into disrepair. And there was also at that time the challenges for the workers around the middle class and the degree to which they agreed with the Chavez regime, and a lot of those skilled workers decided that life was going to be better elsewhere, and that's why there's skilled Venezuelans all around the world in the oil industry.
It's in Venezuela.
Not so many. Yeah.
So in 2007, Exxon and ConocoPhillips, they remained, but some American oil firms just left entirely, right? Because they didn't want.
I think they left as well.
Shell-
It was only Chevron that was left.
2017 was the last expropriation, and I think that's when they left.
So there's no US oil firm.
Chevron has managed to have a relationship where it's maintained a relationship with PDVSA, the Venezuela government, but also with the US administration to maintain its presence there, despite all the sanctions that are being put in place. So they're the only remaining US company.
So you've got a US firm digging up Venezuelan oil that can't sell the oil to its own home country due to the sanctions?
No, Chevron can, for the oil that it produces, for its proportion of the facilities that it has about 175,000 barrels a day, or its own production, it can process in the US. It largely processes themselves, or it could sell it. The rest is largely under sanctions, and prior to the blockade of mid-December, that was making its way to China.
In this shadow market that we were talking about.
Bit of a shadow fleet.
Shadow fleet.
So it was largely being sold to companies that were outside the US financial system, because anybody dealing with these could get secondary sanctions from the US, and so all the transactions were not in dollar terms.
So I suppose fast forward to today, and Trump's gone in and he's apprehended Maduro. He's left the country with Maduro, and Maduro's deputies are now running the show. But supposedly, as they say, they're kind of willing to work with the US administration on sort of joint project where some of the oil profits go to Venezuela and some of them go to the US. But I mean, how eager are oil companies to get back into the Venezuelan market? considering what's happened in the past, and also considering, we're recording on January 21st. I think Maduro was captured less than 3 weeks ago. I mean, at the moment, we're still in a very volatile situation. No one really understands who the leader of Venezuela is going to be this time next year and what's going to happen with the whole agreement. So, I mean, how eager is the oil industry to step back into Venezuela?
Some parts not so. Some parts probably interested. Because if you think of the meeting that President Trump held, I think, to quote Darren Woods, he talked about it being uninvestable. There are elements around, I think it's under the
Darren Woods is of
the Exxon CEO. I think his comment was uninvestable, but I think you have to dig out the whole of the sentence. I think it's in the current financial regime and the uncertainty about security. So it's often been pulled out as uninvestable, but I think that's in the current circumstances of how money is shared on these contracts. And also most of the companies, travel is banned. Travel to Venezuela is banned. Yeah. So there's lots of interest. If we think about what needs to be done, there's a general understanding that a lot of the equipment is in poor states of repair. Yeah. The easiest thing to do to get production up would be to fix the infrastructure, work over the wells. Comes into the service companies. Some of the service companies have expressed interest in going back into Venezuela because a lot of these companies will operate in frontier places and will have people that are quite willing to do that. So the service companies have expressed more interest. You've got some of the oil trading companies, Vitol and Trafigura, that are already coordinating shipments out of the country and managing logistics and taking on the marketing of the crude to new customers. So it depends where you are in the value chain. But the service companies, yes. Some of the smaller private US companies, very much so. Some of the larger US companies that have sort of publicly listed are being much, much more cautious. Yeah.
Well, isn't it because they need the real long-term visibility? The service companies can deal with the oil as presented to them. The actual oil companies themselves, they need to be looking 10, 20 years because this investment they're talking about, is that $100 billion a year or was that in total? That was Donald Trump's number.
Yeah, it's a very large number. I don't think anybody really knows, because I don't think anybody has. So probably Chevron has the most credible idea because they're in country and so understand the state of the service sector, how stable things are, how poorly equipment has been maintained in other places. But it's a very large number, and so if people are looking to invest, it is very large, significant investments that are multi-billion dollars, which means they will take many years to earn a return. So you need to be confident that investment you'll be able to access in 4 or 5 years when it comes on, because any major new project, they're not quick to develop either. So if you're looking for the oil majors where they're looking at major new developments, stability of the country, stability of the fiscal regime, the ability to get money out, those are key factors alongside the break-even economics. It could be a fantastically profitable field, but if you're not sure who you're dealing with in the next 1 or 2 years, that overweighs things because then those assets could, that project may not come about or you may not have access to the funds from it. So
is that enough to make it unattractive? And can I just throw into the stability is that this current American administration is pointing guns at what it perceives as the bad guys in Venezuela and has got the backs of the interim government. But that's not always going to be the case necessarily. And so can the oil companies rely on that support from the American government?
What does Trump or whoever's running the US need to do to kind of convince the biggest oil firms that there will be the security and the stability there for them to actually go in and invest?
This is the challenge to the US. It doesn't have its own national oil company. So it's trying to encourage private companies to do that. Yeah. And so that makes it difficult because they will make their own investment decisions. Because if you look at the likes of any of the oil majors, they have a portfolio of projects that they are looking at and developing and ranking and assessing and trying to work out where best to deploy their capital. So it's in a sense, what's been opened up is a potentially new area for project development, but it comes with an awful lot of above ground risks that at the moment are not very clear. So what you're likely to see is a number of the companies will establish local operations to get to understand what actually it is like for people on the ground there. How does this work, along with how stable is the regime, and then made those decisions. Then for the oil majors, Chevron aside, they need to get themselves back in the country to understand what it's really like there.
So these will just be small, almost test projects where they're just going to drag a little bit of oil out of the ground.
They may not do it, but they'll establish a presence and then try and work out what to do. They may not actually invest in very much initially because they'll have to assess what opportunities are there for them.
And how long do you think that process will take?
Yeah, that's a multi-year type process. So
Right.
our outlook is
Right.
So if we think of our Venezuelan production outlook, we've got it actually dropped a little bit because effectively the blockade has limited the amount of volume that's been going to China. It's not a great deal of infrastructure that's available. The tanks seem to be quite full, in which case production will likely need to be curtailed until you can get back to this 800,000 barrels a day export level. At the moment, it's probably about half of that if we use our vessel tracking as to see what's being loaded and where it's going to. So the system for oil exports needs to be established, new customers found. That is all going through a bank account in Qatar now, I think, is where that's been nominated for. So that need to get back to the 800,000 barrels a day production levels and sustainable exports. And then there'll be a period. So we've got oil production rising probably towards the end of this year into next year as some of those service companies come in and go, oh, actually, that's something that we can do quite quickly and we can agree how we're going to do that and then we can get paid quite quickly. Longer term growth depends on the rehabilitation of a number of facilities, which are bigger projects. So that's not months. Yeah, that's probably much lower. And to be honest, we have some scenarios. We don't have a forecast because we just don't know enough.
So is the only way for Venezuela to sell its PDVSA oil, is that to go through American companies to get around the sanctions? Is it only the Chevron oil that is legally coming, or when I say legally, when is coming out with American approval at the moment?
That's changing. So I think you've got Vitol and Trafigura are marketing Venezuelan oil on behalf of the US authorities. So when they find buyers for it and they can agree the price and the payment terms and all those things, letters of credit are all checked and done, then that's when that oil will start to then flow to probably other US refineries. But also if we go back 2010s when Venezuela production was much higher, there was a reasonable proportion of Venezuelan oil was going to India because it was valuable in places like Jamnagar. And so we're hearing things of Venezuelan oil being offered to Indian refiners at a price level and Chinese refiners at a different price level. And so they're starting that marketing process. So what we understand currently is the oil is being moved into the Caribbean and that will go into storage because it has the opportunity to go on a VLCC long haul to Asia.
So just to step back a bit, Venezuela has not been allowed to export its oil to the US market in recent years.
Other than Chevron.
Other than that small amount from Chevron.
175,000, 200,000 barrels a day, Chevron.
And even though the US has come into the country like they have, is that restriction still in place today?
Chinese buyers have left, is what we understand.
So Chinese buyers have left, but the US also hasn't relaxed its rules around
relaxing them.
It is,
yes.
right.
Where exactly they are now, I'm not sure, but it's relaxing them. Yeah. Because it needs to if it's going to have a fund where the money is shared between the US and Venezuela, the oil needs to be sold.
So in the coming weeks, presumably there will be Venezuelan oil entering the US market.
Yeah. In addition to what's already flowing to Chevron. Yeah.
So I suppose the question is, I mean, I think the US is actually the biggest oil producing nation at the moment. I mean, you're the expert.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
What's their motivation for going to Venezuela to exploit their oil? Why not just keep it focused at home?
Or I guess a supplementary to that is the heavy crude that Venezuela's got, as opposed to the lighter, sweeter crude that American gets through its shale oils.
Why have they done what they've done? That's a really good question. It arguably fits in the concept of energy dominance. You've also had the issue of was it the Dunroe doctrine now, the Munro that Donald has adopted, of being the dominant regional power within your hemisphere, and they saw a risk associated with Venezuela through Chinese and Russian involvement, because the Chinese and the Russians have been involved in Venezuela's upstream industry and have been participating in its production. So it's there's probably a couple of things that are going there, and it's got oil. If you think of energy dominance, it's very much a hydrocarbon energy dominance. So I think putting all those things together, perhaps under the guise also of drug running and all of those things, have contributed to the decision to do what they've done. The issue with light oil and heavy oil is the US Gulf Coast is arguably one of the largest and most sophisticated refining centers. Export oriented, but initially designed to feed the US. But what you had in the 70s and 80s was the growth in Mexican production and the growth in Venezuelan production. And that's heavy oil. Yeah. So we've got where Brent that's quite light. The Venezuelan and Mexican stuff, if you took a bucket and poured it on the floor, it would look like bitumen. It would gently settle out. It's a big solid lump. It's very hard to move. You tend to have to dilute it.
So it's viscous rather than kind of a thin liquid.
Yeah, it's molasses in disguise. You sort of look at it. It is like road asphalt sort of stuff. And as you got the production growing strongly in Mexico and Venezuela, what you had was that it was very hard for the US refineries at the time to process it. Because what you actually need is a coking unit where you take it, you basically convert some of it into petroleum coke that competes with coal, into power generation or into cement manufacturing. But that thermal decomposition gives you some other components you convert into transport fuels. But you need this residue upgrading processes to do it. And there were various projects and joint ventures to build these coking units all across the Gulf Coast. And so it's upgrading the refineries, but the partnerships where they jointly invested was, we'll supply you the oil, you build the machine. After a certain amount of time, then we've both benefited from it. Because prior to that, for the refiner to take it, they would only take it at a very, very high price discount, because it's really hard for us to process. So it has to be really cheap for us to be interested in it. So this was a way of making the oil more valuable and investing in the refining capacity to make the refineries able to process it.
And this all happened in the 70s and the 80s.
70s, 80s.
And at this point, the US, it was not a big oil producing nation in terms of domestic extraction.
That all came about with the rise of US tight oil at around about 2010, because the US used to be a big importer. So it depends where you are in history. In the 20s, 30s, the US was the biggest producer. It's kind of now back up there, but a lot of that has been all around US tight oil, particularly in the Permian. So this horizontal drilling and fracking, no? So you've now got the West Texas Permian is producing 6 million barrels a day. 2010, it was virtually nothing. Right?
And so the current American refining capability isn't able to cope with their own oil as well as it is with the heavy crudes that come from Venezuela.
For US light oils, for a light oil, WTI or Brent, anybody can process them. Yeah. So on the basis that now they can be exported, then actually, if you can export WTI, chunks of it are going, there's a large flow going to Europe, there's a large flow going to Asia, because it's a crude that anybody can process. It's quite expensive. So you don't build a refinery to process an expensive crude. You invest in a refinery to process a heavier, sourer, lower quality crude because it's got a price discount. And so you're investing to capture the price discount.
Mm-hmm.
The US having set itself up on being able to process heavy crudes, it's hard then to process light crudes.
But why doesn't it, rather than investing in the Venezuelan oil industry, why doesn't it just invest in its own refining capability?
Apart from a few select projects, Valero's done one or two, and Exxon has done one at Beaumont. The US doesn't need more refining capacity. Refining projects typically are not particularly attractive commercially in terms of the returns they're looking for. And if at the moment, because you can export WTI out to the US, the price difference between them is pretty small. Go back to 2014, 2015, you couldn't export crude out to the US because that was a system was put in the early 70s when the OPEC embargo, apart from some streams that crossed into northern Canada, that were grandfathered because the oil field is one side of the border and the refinery was the other, and those were able to continue. So at the time, US shale took off, and then basically it got stranded. And then if you could process light US oil, you had a $10, $15 advantage because the difference between Brent and WTI blew out to about $15, $20. Those conditions, yes, you would build refining capacity, but the US saw that actually the broader benefit to its oil industry was to support its oil production, and so would allow exports to the global market. And so WTI is only $3, $4, $5 below Brent. Yeah? And so what we don't have is the oil majors or US refiners adding capacity. Right? The returns are low. Yeah?
So basically, there's a legacy refining operation for heavy crude that needs to be. They need that heavy crude,
and they've been processing Canadian volumes of similar quality that have come down by pipelines from Canada. Yeah?
So is there potentially a Canadian angle in this, then, that perhaps with the more tense relations between the US and Canada in the last year, kind of with Trump's sort of antagonism towards the Canadian administration, that actually they're looking at Venezuela as potentially a way of saying to Canada, we don't need your heavy crude. We've got Venezuela, so, we've got you over a barrel effectively. Whereas before, maybe Canada would sort of said, well, we've actually got you over a barrel. You need our heavy crude to support your Gulf state refineries.
They're both interdependent. So about a year ago, there was the threat of sanctions between US and Canada, and what would that do to the price of oil, and huge debates and uncertainty. And all of a sudden, the tariff aspect was taken away from energy because large parts of the US process Canadian natural gas. There's all sorts of things, they're quite interlinked, so we just take the energy aspects away. The Canadian upstream sector is very dependent upon the US because that's where most of its crude is processed. They've all got very few alternatives. There's an expansion of Trans Mountain to the west coast of Canada that's relatively small, but a lot of the Canadian volumes they produce are processed in the US. We see over time additional volumes of Venezuelan material going into the US because it's got the capability to process it. It doesn't really threaten the volumes that come down from Canada, but it will probably just lower the prices a little bit. But the Canadian upstream and the US refining sector are heavily integrated.
Is there much difference in cost between Canadian crude and Venezuelan crude?
In terms of the costs of getting it out of the ground, it always varies field by field, but broadly not so much in terms of the fields that are operating. The challenge in sort of Venezuela is if you're building new projects in Venezuela, they're going to probably prove relatively expensive compared to Canada because Canada's got a lot of the infrastructure there.
If the Venezuelan industry is going to be rebuilt, these massive reserves, it's got bigger reserves than Saudi Arabia, I believe now. But they're in this Orinoco belt, which is kind of inaccessible, I believe.
Tricky, yeah.
But it's tricky, and the actual crude itself is, as you say,
Galupi is a brilliant word for it. It needs to be diluted to be moved. So
to get out and moved out to the ground as well. So are there a lot of technical difficulties involved in re-establishing the whole industry? Things a lot of it needs to be built from scratch again.
Yes, but it is largely under because it's been done before. The technology is largely understood. It's probably got better, yeah.
But we have said that the people aren't there anymore. They've scattered themselves around the world. And you said earlier about the way that the American oil companies might go into Venezuela is to set up small local operations. But there aren't the skills for those local operations. They would still need to be supplied by the American oil companies, wouldn't they?
There's all sorts of people that will need to be deployed. Yeah, the analogous industry arguably is the Canadian oil industry. Yeah, so there will be people that need to be enticed to get involved in the redevelopment of the oil industry in Venezuela. They may be Venezuelans choosing to go back. They may be people who've got some experience who just want to go for the adventure. You look at some of the service companies and they'll merrily put recent graduates in strange places and let them get on with it. And then some of them will be
people who aren't married with no kids, that sort of thing. There is that skills element, but I kind of interrupted your point there, is that it is going to be expensive to regenerate the oil or develop those reserves.
Yeah. And that's the challenge. So there's not many projects that were being considered that we sort of understand. When we look at the costs, the break-even costs of these new projects, you end up with very conservative, potentially high numbers under the current fiscal regime. That kind of goes, well, the oil companies need to be comfortable that these are going to make money. If they're going to try and make money under our understanding of sort of the recent regime, you need an oil price of 80, and you need it for a sustained period. And that's very much higher than our sort of current forecast. So that's why the companies are also being cautious. They have a portfolio of opportunities and they're looking to invest in developing resources that have low break-even costs and also that have relatively low emissions, because the industry is looking about how it decarbonizes its operations. And so resources that are in unstable regimes that look like they're very costly to develop and also have a very high emissions intensity don't go to the top of the list.
So there's a higher emissions associated with digging out heavy crude.
Yeah, just because the energy you need to do
right.
it. Yeah.
Right. And let's say the Venezuelan operation, I mean, let's say it does take off, basically. Oil companies do get interested. They're convinced that the US administration has made Venezuelan political climate stable enough to invest in. Is your organization, is Wood Mackenzie predicting that oil prices could fall in the next few years as a result of just Venezuela? And if so, is there going to be a knock-on effect to renewables? The renewables will become, less competitive with traditional fossil fuel generated electricity, for example.
At the moment, we're scoping out what it could look like. Yeah. So
where we're at the moment, we're about $60 a barrel. Is that right?
It's gone up the last few days because the spat around Greenland has caused a bit of dollar weakness, and also Chevron has stopped production at Tengiz because of a power outage. So it's gone up a couple of dollars because of dollar weakness, uncertainty around protests around Iran as to Iranian production, and also that all of a sudden there's a bit of a production curtailment. So our sort of base case outlook for this year is Brent is going to be around 60 for this year, a little bit stronger next year, and then creeps up. So in the near term, what's happening to Venezuela, the potential for extra production doesn't have much of an impact on our outlook because we don't see much more volume coming. Yeah. Upstream colleagues are challenged with what could be done, so they're coming up with scenarios rather than a forecast. And if the conditions are right, there's some greenfield development, there's rehabilitation, and possibly 10 years' time, there's maybe an additional 1 million barrels a day. Yeah.
Are you talking from sort of a theoretical peak today of 800,000? We
could be up to 1.82 million. And you go, oh, that's quite a lot. But in a sense, you're in an oil market that at the moment is about 104 million barrels a day. Yeah. And the fantastic thing about the oil industry is it's an extractive resource, and on stream fields, production declines. So even if demand doesn't move, the upstream industry needs to reinvest to maintain production. That's the brilliant thing about it.
Because every project only has a limited lifespan.
They only have a limited lifespan. Yeah. And so that's why sort of upstream delivers higher value, because there's always a need for ongoing investment. If we suddenly go, oh, there's an extra 1 million barrels a day production in Venezuela in about 10 years or so. What does that do? It's probably only a few dollars on our long-term oil price forecasts. What might change? There might be a few projects that are slightly delayed. Maybe there's less drilling in the US, but at that level, say 10 years out, it's actually quite small. Yeah, because it's It's only an extra 1 million barrels a day in a market that's about 107, 108, and it's just diverting investment from somewhere else. So we don't see it being that transformative based on it's going to take a long time to do this.
And this is even in sort of best case scenario, right? Where
Worst case, you have country instability and production plummets. In which case you take 800,000 barrels a day off the market. And that'll
Which again, in the bigger scheme of things, isn't actually that much.
No, it's in an equilibrium world, it's a few dollars. Yeah, on the day or the event, then when markets the pendulum tends to overswing, so you probably see much more of a sharper impact in the short term if all of a sudden there was a revolution in Venezuela.
Like, I'm sure I heard on one of Trump's speeches about this that he was wanting to push the price of a barrel of oil down to $50, and this is going to impact the cost of gas at the pump, because that's his big driver, is to improve cost of living in America. But from what you've just told us, the differences are going to be inconsequential. That's not going to happen.
And even if that does happen, it won't happen for many years anyway.
Yeah, that's fair. We do see a strong interest in lowering the US gasoline price, because the consumer feels that as a tax
and contributes to inflation.
Yeah, and all that sort of stuff. And it might well be actually something to offset the rise in electricity prices that the US consumer is feeling, because natural gas prices are stronger because of a bit of an AI, because the energy requirements of the AI boom, and also LNG as an exporter. So the price of electrical power in the US has gone up. And maybe this is a way of trying to mitigate as a cost of living. But affordability was something that the Democrats played on heavily in the recent elections, and might well be their mantra going into the midterms. And this might be his way to try and mitigate that. Yeah.
But as you say, it probably won't be that effective.
Not in the short term. Yeah.
Okay. Well, just to pick up on Jack's other point there about the effect it could have if there is a lot of oil coming into America, and this current administration is a bit dismissive of climate change and everything around that. Could this have a really negative effect on the amount of development of renewable technologies?
The US administration is distinctly underwhelmed by renewables and is actively trying to undermine it in various ways, though I think the Ørsted wind farm has got a reprieve on the court case. You're looking at subsidies or support being reduced and removed. That will slow the growth of renewables in the US. It's very clear this administration is very much against it. Probably in some ways, given recent events, might spur interest in renewables in other countries to avoid people trying to be less dependent upon US energy. So probably a bit of swings around it. Will it slow the technology development? A lot of the technology development now is actually in China, and they're the ones that are exporting solar panels and the like.
Well, we should probably start wrapping up, but I just thought, at the end of the day, who do you think are going to be the big winners and losers from this whole thing?
Thanks for that lovely question.
I mean, you got basically the Venezuelan government, the Venezuelan people, the US government, the US.
Oh yeah, I was going to
and the oil sector in the middle of that.
Let me do the oil sector first, then we can think about it.
Okay.
So if Venezuelan production creeps up, the first corporates that will benefit will actually be the US refiners, because they'll have more heavy crude available to them to process, to take advantage of what they're set up for. So those US Gulf Coast refiners will see more crude they're better designed for at a discount that makes it attractive to run. They'll be the ones that benefit arguably first from having access to the crude that previously wasn't, because it was being sanctioned and moved to China. The next ones after that are probably the service companies, because they'll be the ones that go in to rehabilitate wells, work them over, get the production volumes up. After that, it is probably more towards the larger oil companies who think about, once it's shown to be stable, once the fiscal regime is right, okay, this is now an attractive place to invest and we're comfortable in doing that. And then, in a sense, right the way down the end of the chain, there's probably a threat to the US refiners in the long, long term. And that's because if once Venezuela starts to get some income, right, living standards rise, demand goes up, they'll think about rehabilitating their refineries, because if there is a refinery on north coast of Venezuela, which I never say right, is Paraguayana, that used to be the world's largest refining center at just under 1 million barrels a day, a couple of facilities together, that's running at about 20% utilization. So at some point, they'll bring that back to something like what it was, in which case there'd be a major product exporter, because it's very rare for major crude producers and crude exporters to import product, because you just build your own facilities. So long term, that's when the US refiners start to see more competition. But that'll be something that the Venezuelan government chooses to invest in. So you can arguably say who benefits first. It's probably those people with equities in US refiners, because it's not going to change the gasoline price in the US. Arguably after that, it should be, at what pace does money go back into Venezuela? Where does it get spent?
I don't. Just on top of that, and sorry for finishing on a really political question. Everything about Trump going into Venezuela and approaching the whole situation, or creating the situation as he has, screams out to me that this is not the way that a government should be conducting itself. But having looked into this a bit more, is it actually a good thing for Venezuela, much as it grieves me to say so?
A very non-political answer is time will tell, because I saw a survey recently where something like 90% of Venezuelans outside Venezuela thought it was a good thing. It was less than half, and I can't remember the survey, of people in Venezuela who were interviewed and willing to give an answer said it was a good thing. So if it improves the quality of living, the stability, the legal structure of people in Venezuela, in time they will probably think it's a good thing. The issue is that of, it's a horrible word to use, but colonialization. Yeah. So how does that actually play out? Because a lot of, if we go back to Chavez when he was been elected, and his high popularity, which was at a time of very, very high oil prices, they were very anti-American. So to what degree does that sentiment also prevail? If the situation deteriorates, then anti-American sentiment could become very strong in the country. Yeah, you have to hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And the worst case is, and this is probably the issue for the oil majors, the worst case is things could be unstable.
As you say, only time will tell. All right then, Alan, well, thank you so much for helping us today with this incredibly complex and volatile subject. If you'd like to contact Alan, you can do so through the Wood Mackenzie website, I presume.
I believe so.
And if you'd like to listen to more of our E+T Off the Page podcast, you'll find plenty of them on our website and the E+T Magazine YouTube channel. So until the next time, from all of us here, goodbye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.